Now, the press blast for Acolyte of the Altar, at least in my inbox, was Magic the Gathering meets Shadow of the Colossus, which, needless to say, sounds intriguing for a game that also claims to be a roguelike deck builder, and it is a pretty big claim. So of course I asked for a press key and even tried the demo of it a while back. Now, whether Acolyte of the Altar lives up to that is another question, and really I didn't feel the comparison beyond it being card-based and the fact that you're facing off against essentially monolithic foes on each run in a sort of boss rush format. So the claim really only stands up to superficial inspection. Though, in spite of that, I did actually enjoy the gameplay itself, since it ends up feeling like more of a mix of deck builder and puzzle mechanics due to how the enemies and progression are designed. I think the one thing it lacks though, especially with the roguelike term and its modern context, is proper meta progression, at least in the press version of the game. So each run feels very self-contained, with most of the variety coming from how you handle various enemies you encounter with the deck you have assembled. Generally speaking, each run takes about an hour, maybe 2 if you play it exceptionally relaxed, or less than that if you play it fast. This means it can feel a bit repetitive if you really don't click with the systems, especially since there's only 18 different enemies, of which you encounter 12 on any given run. This leads to a question of replayability, and that mostly comes from personal challenges and trying out the other faction, since you can stack up to 9 different challenge modes that make the run more difficult, and you can go purely one faction, or you can choose to mix and match a primary and secondary faction from the 3. For some people, this will be enough, since they thrive on beating their previous best run or on doing everything on hard mode, or even just getting all the achievements. For me, once I beat it with all the factions, I didn't really feel much desire to go back into it, except for maybe raising the difficulty a little bit to get access to enemies with more varied abilities. That's why my playtime on this title is relatively short compared to the other games I've reviewed, that and I'm really used to deck builders, so it didn't take me long to beat. I got my enjoyment out of it, unlocked lore, did a couple challenge runs, and felt satisfied. Weirdly though, in spite of this short playtime, there is actually one very specific niche of people that I would highly recommend Acolyte of the Altar for, and that's people making their own deck builders. This is because while the game lacks longevity for me, I actually really loved the enemy design in this. Each one had its own unique flavor, had multiple solutions to deal with them, and only very rarely became pushovers, and that was just because my deck happened to be hard counter to their individual gimmick. And as you up the challenge mode, like I said, enemies do get new abilities, so this becomes even more challenging to kind of push them into that pushover mode. And really, there wasn't a single enemy that felt just like a generic slapfest. Some were just straight combat, but yeah, you had some interesting stuff going on. I just wish there was a campaign extension to let you dig further into the established mechanics, since as it stands, the length really only has you building up a handful of cards, and while I like the deck size limit since it prevents bloating and forces you to think a bit more about what you play each and every round to avoid an empty hand board failure, I feel the game would benefit a bit more from variety and length there. My primary wish in all of this would actually to be able to see you go through multiple zones rather than just the one. This would give the excuse of introducing potentially more cards, deck extensions, monsters, etc., and even more challenge modes. Barring this, even just an endless mode unlock with the current options would help it a ton, barring some form of meta progression being added. Now, I did gush about the bosses, and your cards are no slouches either, but there were a few that really stood out to me as being particularly interesting. In the cards, that would be what you have the ability to infect enemy abilities to cause them to damage them every turn, stall their charge-ups, or even destroy them entirely, changing the dynamic of the fight by removing or altering abilities. You also have the ability to redirect enemy abilities back at them. The creatures also have interesting dynamics, allowing them to move around, though I admittedly only got legally distinct Courage the Cowardly Dog through to the final boss once. In terms of enemies though, that's when it gets real interesting. There's a boss that dies from eating too many of your units, there's another boss that recruits your units to populate the city it carries on its back, and even an enemy that merges all of your units into one big super unit that it then tries to combo into another one of its abilities to smash your head in. And even one that gives you one big unit while clearing the board, then killing that one unit the turn after. the list just goes on. They're all very interesting. The actual combinations of enemies and even some of the stuff you can get, such as the dog I mentioned trying to rescue a few times, is just wild. And the way they work is that they slowly unlock over the course of the battle. So the first couple turns you might see some minor abilities like a slash or a slap, but by 10 turns in, you'll have enemies charging up nukes to get rid of all your creatures, or that keep doing escalating damage. And so many of them have interactions when you attack, cast spells, or summon units that while attacking is usually the default action, you really do want to mouse over those abilities as they pop up to make sure. Hell, there's even one enemy that sends notes into your hand that have different meanings that whenever you cast them, and yes, you have to cast them to proceed with the turn, you actually get to choose between a buff or a debuff, and some of them are even just a straight heal. Though in the end, much like this review, it does not quite last as long as I'd hope, and it left me wanting for more of the game that it just doesn't quite have the content to deliver on. This sadly feels more like a longish demo with a good difficulty scaling system rather than a deck builder I can really sink my teeth into long term. So it's a thumbs up, but only if you can justify the price for maybe a 5 to 10 hour experience to beat all the achievement goals. And as of writing this, I don't know the price, so I cannot make a good judgment call. But if you want to see more reviews ad-free, check out the Patreon where yes, even free followers get all of these ad-free.